A mother German shepherd stood chained beside a frost-covered guardrail, her two puppies nestled close to her trembling legs. Their fur was frozen stiff with ice, their cries lost to the biting cold. Along that very road, a Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole drove through the relentless storm, not searching for life, but fleeing from his own shadow. Though the war had ended years before, it haunted his mind like a battle never truly won. Then through his headlights he caught the faintest flicker, a pair of eyes that refused to surrender. In that fleeting moment, the soldier inside him stirred to life once more. What he chose to do next would alter not just their destiny, but his own as well. Before we dive deeper, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop the name of your country in the comments below. This was the kind of winter Wyoming never made excuses for. A silence so thick it seemed to swallow even the sound of the howling wind. Snow fell endlessly from a sky the color of pewter, blanketing the winding mountain road in a white, ghostly shroud. Pines bowed under the weight branches heavy with frost, while the earth below remained suspended in a slow, breathless stillness. The only sign of life was an old truck inching through the storm's grasp. Its headlights were dimmed, swallowed by the swirling veil of snow. Inside sat Ethan Cole, a 38-year-old former Navy SEAL who had endured more winters in more unforgiving places than most could imagine, places that never truly left him. His face was etched with the marks of survival, faint scars tracing his jawline, the first strands of gray threading through his close-cropped dark hair, and a light stubble that spoke of a man who gave up on mirrors long ago. His eyes, steel blue and unwavering, scanned the road ahead with relentless vigilance, the same unyielding focus that had once kept him alive on the battlefield. He wore a heavy wool coat collar pulled high against the chill, but the cold that bit at him had little to do with the weather outside. Since leaving the Navy 2 years ago, Ethan had exchanged the chaos of war for the quiet solitude of the mountains. Yet stillness was no substitute for peace. He had come to these woods seeking to forget. But memories refused to fade. They froze within him like trapped ghosts beneath layers of ice. Sometimes beneath the hum of the truck's engine, he could still hear the crackling radio from that last Arctic mission, voices shouting through static men buried beneath endless snow, the world collapsing into a blinding white void. As the road jolted sharply ahead, he caught through the swirling snowfall a shadow near the guardrail, a lifeless heap. Instinct compelled him to slow. He leaned forward, squinting through the icy windshield. The shape shifted. There was motion, a flicker of life, not mere debris, but something holding on. Ethan brought the truck to a hushed stop, boots crunching against the thick snow as he stepped out into the biting cold. The air gnawed at him, instantly sharp with the scent of iron and pine stinging deep in his lungs. He pulled his scarf higher, pressing on. His boots sank deep with each step. Then he saw her, a German shepherd, thin and worn, chained to the cold metal rail. Her fur, once rich black and tan, was matted with frost, her body shivering violently. 2 tiny puppies huddled beneath her, pressed so close to her belly that they were nearly invisible at first glance. Their fur stiff with ice, their breaths shallow vapor fading away in the storm's fury. Ethan paused a few feet away, lowered himself carefully to meet her gaze. There in her eyes, he found a courage and loyalty that refused to die. Dark and watchful, despite his weariness, his gaze locked onto the dogs. There was no anger there, only fear mixed with fierce defiance. The very look soldiers wear when they know surrender will cost them their lives. "It's okay," Ethan whispered gently, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "I won't hurt you." He extended his gloved hand slowly. The mother dog didn't growl, only flinched, bracing for pain. Her chain clinked, a heavy metal link cinched tight and padlocked around her neck. The sight squeezed Ethan's heart, clear his throat. Someone had abandoned her here to die. He fumbled with his pocket knife, flicking the blade open carefully, slipping it under the frozen clasp of metal. Easy, girl. You've been through enough. His voice was low and steady, the same calm he used to steady men caught in chaos. After a few tense moments, the chain snapped sharply free. The dog trembled, but didn't move. Ethan shrugged off his coat, gathering the tiny puppies into its warmth first. They were little more than wobbly bundles of fur shivering weakly against his chest. Then he wrapped the coat around their mother, folding her gently before lifting her tenderly into his arms. She weighed more than she appeared, the kind of burden borne by carrying pain too long. Snow stung his face as he trudged back to the truck, heart hammering. He laid the dogs carefully in the passenger seat, turned the heater on, full blast wiping frost from their fur and his eyelashes. The mother curled instinctively around her pups, breathing shallow but steady. Ethan grabbed the old radio mic on his dashboard and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Cole near Pine Ridge. I've got 3 dogs, a mother, and 2 pups found chained up and freezing. Is anyone there?" After a beat, a calm, steady voice replied, "This is Helen Ward from Fremont County Animal Rescue. Copy that, sir." "What's their condition?" Her voice warmed through the static, soft but strong, like someone who'd endured hardship without losing hope. Ethan imagined her without trying, a woman in her late 50s, hair tied back neatly, her face marked by time but gentle. The kind of presence that could calm a storm simply by speaking. "The mother's injured," he said, voice tight. "Neck wound from the chain. The pups, I don't know if they'll make it." "Listen carefully," Helen advised. "Get them somewhere warm. Hold the little ones close to your chest if you can. Don't give them food or water just yet. Warmth first, breathing next. Is there shelter nearby?" "I have a cabin," Ethan replied, "half a mile down the ridge." "Then drive," she said firmly. "I'll stay with you till you get there." The radio crackled as the truck lurched forward, headlights cutting through the swirling storm. Helen's voice flickered in and out, steadying him between the roar of the wind and hiss of the heater. "You'll need soft towels, maybe a blanket. Rub gently. If the pups twitch, that means they're still fighting. Don't lose hope." Ethan let out a small, grim laugh. "Not much hope left lately." "Then borrow some from them," she said. "They've got plenty even now." He said nothing, but her words stayed with him. As the cabin appeared, a small wooden refuge barely visible through the thick white veil. Ethan's hands were numb, Clear's throat, and the windshield blurred thick with frost. He pulled up, stepped out, and carefully carried the bundled family into the cabin. The chill and darkness welcomed him inside. Striking the lantern near the stove, its faint flame cast a soft, amber glow that barely pierced the shadows. The firewood lay stacked just where he'd left it. Kneeling down, he sparked the hearth, and soon the crackling fire replaced the wind's mournful howl. Ethan spread his wool blanket near the hearth, gently laying the puppies down first. They whimpered softly, fragile sounds, like the creak of old floorboards. Taking an old towel, he soaked it in warm water and tenderly began to rub them, loosening the stiffness in their fur. Their tiny chests rose and fell, delicate yet breathing. The mother, still nameless to him, lay close by her eyes, wary and watchful, ready to defend if he faltered. Her ribs pressed against her fur, and her paws were raw from the biting ice. Ethan poured a bowl of warm water and placed it just within her reach, stepping back slowly. She sniffed the bowl, drinking without ever losing sight of him. "You're safe now," he whispered, sitting cross-legged beside her. "You did well, girl." The firelight painted her in flickering shades of gold and shadow. Her head dropped low as fatigue overcame her guard. The 2 puppies twitched near her side, and one let out a faint sneeze. Ethan allowed a faint smile and reached for the radio voice barely above a whisper. "They're breathing again." Helen's distant voice crackled back. "Good. Keep them warm through the night. You've done everything you can." The line went silent with a soft hiss. Ethan stared down at the family before him, the fire's warmth slowly seeping into his bones. For the first time in years, the quiet wasn't a sentence but a balm. The puppies shifted, their breathing steady, now small, rhythmic, fragile, but undeniably alive. Ethan exhaled deeply, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at them, the mother, her quiet strength, and the two little ones clinging to her warmth, and felt something inside him soften. "Grace," he said softly, tracing the air above her head. "Your name is Grace." His gaze moved to the pups. "And you Hope and Echo names that fit perfectly." Ethan leaned back against the chair, watching the firelight dance across their fur. His voice barely a whisper, trembling with a feeling he hadn't dared to touch in years. "We won't perish in the snow," he said. "Not tonight." Outside, the storm roared relentlessly. Inside, 3 fragile lives and a broken man found enough warmth to start anew. The next morning dawned pale and still over the Wyoming wilderness. Snow covered the ridge in a thick blanket, but inside Ethan's cabin the fire still breathed faintly, casting the room in gentle tones of gold and ash. The storm had passed, leaving a world muted in white, a fresh scar beneath the endless sky. Ethan stood at the window, coffee mug in hand, watching sunlight glitter off the frozen pine branches. His breath fogged the glass, and for a moment he marveled at how something as cold as snow could make the world seem so tender. Behind him, a rustling sound caught his attention. The German Shepherd, now fully awake, stretched rigidly beside the hearth, her coat catching the firelight in streaks of black and tan. Yet her ribs stood out like sharp ridges beneath her thin fur. Her eyes flicked toward him, keen, wary, fiercely protective. The 2 puppies, Hope and Echo, nestled close to her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with soft, fluttering breaths. Ethan crouched a few paces away, careful not to startle her. "Morning, Grace," he whispered, testing the name he had chosen for her. She flinched at his voice but didn't growl this time. A fragile progress, but a promise nonetheless. He had left a bowl of water by the wall, half frozen through the night. Grace approached, cautiously sniffing before she drank. When Ethan reached for a can of dog food, her ears pricked up and her body stiffened. He moved deliberately, slow and steady, every motion patient and calm. Years in the Navy had taught him how to approach the scared, the wounded, the cornered. Usually men holding guns, not dogs bearing scars. He opened the can, spooned the food into a tin bowl, then placed it near her. Sitting back a few feet, hands resting on his knees, he murmured, "Eat? You've earned this." The mother hesitated, eyes flickering between the food and him, then inched forward. When she finally ate, her tail gave a cautious flick, a silent truce. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's it, we're getting there." Hours slipped by in quiet rhythm. Ethan kept the fire burning, refreshed the water, and sealed a leak in the window frame. Grace watched her gaze, wary but softening, a bit each time he knelt to feed her pups. They were livelier now, yipping quietly, their ears still folded and paws too big for their tiny bodies. Hope, the bolder one, tried climbing onto his boot, while Echo nestled closer into their mother's fur. Ethan chuckled quietly. "You two are a handful waiting to happen." In the afternoon, the crunch of tires on snow startled them all. Grace lifted her head and growled low. Ethan stood up and peered through the frosted window. A dark green SUV had stopped near the cabin, and out stepped a tall woman wrapped in a heavy coat, her auburn gray braid catching the sunlight. She moved with the deliberate caution of someone who'd weathered too many winters to be caught off guard. Helen Ward. The voice from the radio had found him. Ethan opened the door, letting in a burst of frosty air. Helen smiled softly, a warmth born of sincerity rather than routine. Up close, her face was lined but kind. Her skin pale from years beneath the Wyoming sky, her soft green eyes held quiet authority and endless patience. "You must be the Navy man," she said, her voice smooth and steady. "You sounded calmer than most would have been last night." "Old habits," Ethan replied, stepping aside. "Come on in. They're all still alive." Helen entered, her boots thudding gently on the wooden floor. The instant she saw Grace and the pups, her expression shifted, the practiced compassion of someone who had witnessed too many broken creatures, but never grew numb. "Well," she whispered, kneeling slowly. "You're a miracle, sweetheart." Grace growled. "Well," she murmured, lowering herself gently to her knees. You're nothing short of a miracle, my dear. Grace let out a low, protective growl, ears pressed back in submission. Helen remained unwavering. Her voice held that steady, low tone she used on the radio. Easy now. Mama, I'm not here to take your pups just to look. Ethan observed her careful movements, gentle hands, sure and deliberate. She inspected Grace's neck where the fur was worn bare and let out a soft sigh. Someone had chained her for what must have been months. Helen said quietly, "These wounds don't appear overnight. She's a fighter to have lived through this. Stronger than most folks I've crossed paths with," Ethan whispered. Helen looked up, capturing the sorrow and heaviness etched in his eyes and bearing. "Sounds like you understand what survival really costs." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he poured her a cup of coffee. They sat close by the fire, warm steam swirling between them, pinewood scent wrapping around the room. Grace had settled her watchful gaze, softening, no longer growling. "My husband fought in Vietnam." Helen broke the silence after a pause. "He came home, but not his whole self. I tried to mend what was left, but then she faltered, fixating on the flickering flames. War doesn't truly end when the guns go silent, does it?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, it just grows quieter. Quieter until you can't tell if that silence is peace or something far darker." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "He never made it through that quiet. I built this rescue after he was gone. Thought maybe I couldn't save him, but I could save someone else." The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind had softened to a gentle whisper. Grace shifted closer to the hearth, resting her head softly between her paws. Hope crept over to Ethan again, pawing at his boot. This time Grace did not intervene, only watched silently. Ethan lowered his hand, welcoming the tiny pup to climb onto his knee. The rapid heartbeat beneath his palm stirred something inside, not quite joy, but the faintest flicker of it. "They trust quickly," he said. Helen smiled warmly. "That's the beauty of animals. They don't waste time figuring out who earns it, they just know when someone needs it most." For a long moment they sat together in silence. The fire whispered softly, and outside snow began to fall again, slow and gentle. Helen rose to leave, promising to come back in a few days with proper medicine and supplies. At the doorway she paused, her gaze resting on Ethan, with a quiet kindness that carried both thanks and worry. "You did good, Ethan. Not many would have stopped on that road." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I didn't stop for them. Maybe I just didn't want to keep driving." When she left, the cabin was quieter, but far from empty. Grace's steady, deep breathing filled the space. Ethan washed the dishes, fed the fire with fresh wood, then sank back into his chair. Daylight faded into a warm, amber dusk shadows creeping long across the floor. Ethan's eyelids grew heavy, and before he could resist, sleep claimed him, the kind of sleep that only arrives when the body finally feels safe. Grace stirred, her eyes locked on him, his breathing, even his face serene in the dance of firelight. Quietly she slipped from her spot, the soft padding of paws on wood. She approached, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air around his outstretched hand. For a long while, she hesitated. Then with a gentle sigh, she lowered her head and rested it softly on his knee. Ethan didn't wake, but his hand twitched, a silent memory of protection stirring within him. The fire crackled quietly. A gentle glow cast upon them both, while outside snowflakes drifted silently delicate and pure in the quiet morning air. The barrier between man and beast, fear and faith, began to dissolve. Dawn slowly unfolded across the rugged Wyoming ridge. Soft, pale light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Inside, peace reigned, punctuated only by the fire's crackling, occasional wood snaps, and the steady, gentle breaths of 3 small souls asleep by the hearth's warm glow. Ethan Cole stirred in his chair, the stiff ache in his neck a reminder of another night spent dozing upright. He blinked slowly, rubbed his tired eyes, and turned his gaze toward the fire's edge where a blanket lay. Grace lifted her head, ears, alert eyes, steady yet calm. Hope the sturdy of the two pups nudged against her mother's paw, while the smaller one, Echo, remained motionless. Concern furrowed Ethan's brow as he leaned in cautiously, not wanting to startle them. The pup lay limp, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. A faint wheeze escaped its lips. When Ethan touched the pup's fur, he felt a fierce heat. "No, no, no," he murmured, cradling the fragile puppy in his hands. Despite the biting cold, the little one's fever flamed beneath his skin. Grace whimpered softly, pressing against his wrist as if pleading, "Save him." Ethan sprang into action, driven by instinct. Wrapping the pup snugly in his wool shirt, he held him close to his heart. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, already lacing up his boots. Grace followed him to the door, a gentle whine escaping her throat. "I'll bring him back," he vowed. "I promise." Outside, pristine snow stood knee-deep, sparkling faintly under the pale morning sun. Ethan's truck groaned to life after several tries, belching puffs of exhaust into the frigid air. The road to Helen's rescue center wound through dense forest, descending toward the quiet town of Lander, nearly 20 miles away. The journey would take more than an hour, each second a precious thread snatched from fate. As he drove, the wind howled through trees, shaking loose snow burdens from their branches. Ethan glanced down at the tiny bundle nestled against his chest. The puppy's breathing was ragged, every exhale a battle. He grasped tighter, as if willing to share his own warmth. Memories surfaced unbidden, his last rescue in Norway. Carrying a wounded man through a blizzard just like this one. That man hadn't made it. Ethan's jaw clenched. Not this time, he thought, determined. By the time he pulled up to the shelter, frost coated the truck's hood, and his fingers were numb, gripping the cold steering wheel. The building stood at the town's edge, a weathered barn transformed into a refuge, its wooden beams faded by years of relentless snow and sun. A faded sign hung crookedly by the gate, reading Fremont Animal Haven. Thin smoke curled from a chimney, and by the entrance stood Helen Ward, bundled against the cold in a brown wool coat and knitted hat. She spotted the truck and hurried forward. "What happened?" She called her breath a soft mist in the crisp air. Ethan stepped out, cradling the small, fragile bundle. "Echo's sick," he said, voice hoarse. "Can't seem to breathe right. Fever." Without hesitation, Helen led him inside. The shelter was small, but spotless. The air was rich with the scent of pine disinfectant and fresh hay. Rows of kennels lined the walls, most left empty. In the quiet back room, warmed only by the gentle buzz of an old electric heater, Helen motioned for Ethan to place the pup on a neatly folded towel. She pushed her glasses up, then carefully pressed the thermometer against the pup's tender ear. 106 degrees, she whispered. Pneumonia, and a fierce one at that. He's been out in the cold far too long. Ethan's heart sank. "Can you save him?" he asked. "I'll do everything I can," she replied, her voice steady but heavy with weariness. "He needs warmth more than anything right now. If his temperature drops again, his lungs could collapse." She dug through a cabinet drawer, then returned holding a small vial. "A bit of antibiotic, and you've got to keep him close skin to skin. Don't let him get cold, not for a single second." Without hesitation, Ethan unbuttoned his coat, pressed the fragile pup against his chest, then wrapped himself carefully in his jacket again. Helen watched silently, then offered a faint, hopeful smile. "You've done this kind of thing before, haven't you?" she asked. "Something close," he answered softly. "A different kind of mission," Helen said, nodding as she set a kettle on a small stove. Coffee, always coffee. They sat side by side, in the dim glow, steam rising between them like fragile hope. Around them, the shelter breathed a quiet life amidst the loneliness. A few cats curled up in worn baskets. An old golden retriever slumbered near the door. Helen's gaze drifted to the empty cages. "It used to be packed," she said softly. "Dogs from every corner of the county lost abandoned. People cared back then." "What happened?" Ethan asked, voice low. "Funding," she answered simply. "The county slashed our budget last spring. Volunteers gave up. Donations disappeared. I kept it going with my savings." She exhaled quietly, a tremor just barely touching her breath. I can't keep the heat on much longer. When this winter ends, so will the shelter. Ethan looked around the peeling paint, the cracked window taped shut, the thin blankets folded with care over rusted cages. Helen had crafted this sanctuary from the shards of her grief, and now it was fading away. "You shouldn't have to bear this alone," he said gently. Helen's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude shining through her exhaustion. "I don't know any other way," she admitted. He stared into his coffee, watching the ripples shimmer as his hand trembled slightly. "Maybe I can help," he offered at last. "When spring comes, I'll fix this place up. I've built through worse storms." She looked at him, surprised. "You really mean that?" Ethan nodded. "I spent years building things that crumbled. Maybe it's time to build something that lasts." The clock on the wall ticked softly in the quiet room. The hours slipped by, measured in breaths and quiet hope. Ethan stayed near the heater, keeping Echo pressed close to his heart. The pup's tiny heartbeat fluttered like a soft drum beneath his ribs. Whenever the breaths came shallow, Ethan whispered gently, as if his voice alone could breathe life back into the fragile body. Grace's face haunted his thoughts, the way she had looked when he left, eyes full of worry but trust. "I'll bring him back home," he had promised. Helen checked Echo's temperature hourly, her hands tender as she adjusted the blanket. Night enveloped the world. Outside, snowflakes began to drift again, gentle and silent. Inside the rescue center, only the warm glow of the heater and the steady rhythm of breath from man and dog filled the room. Ethan barely stirred, his back aching, arms numb, but his resolve refused to waver. Caught between fatigue and whispered hope, he murmured softly, "Breathe, little one. Your fight isn't over yet." As dawn stretched, the sky blushed faint shades of pink. Helen slipped in quietly, rubbing her hands to chase away the cold. Ethan looked up, his eyes tired and reddened from sleepless hours. The bundle in his arms stirred. A faint, delicate sound escaped a tiny yawn. Echo blinked weakly up at him, fragile but alive. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath heavy with relief and surrender. He had made it. Helen settled beside him, a tired smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Looks like he wasn't the only one fighting," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you didn't just save a dog tonight, Ethan." He gazed down at the vulnerable life pressed close to his heart. "Maybe I was the one saved too." The Wyoming wilderness lay silent beneath a sky of silver frost. Snow covered everything, the cabin's roof, the half-buried fence posts, and the faint, disappearing footprints that stretched from the porch into the wild beyond. Ethan Cole awoke to that eerie silence, a silence that felt wrong the moment his eyes opened. The hearth had dyed cold ash gray and dead. The blanket where Grace and her pups usually slept lay empty. Only a few scattered paw prints dotted the floor. He stepped outside, the cold wind biting against his face. "Grace," he called, his voice echoing through the hollow morning. Only the groan of swaying trees answered. His heart clenched as his eyes traced a fresh line of tracks vanishing into the forest's depths. The prints were deep, heavier than the pups, spaced irregularly, as if the mother had been moving swift and urgent. He retreated indoors, grabbed his coat and gloves, slung a weathered canvas bag over his shoulder. Inside, he packed dried jerky, a flashlight, and a thermos filled with hot coffee. Then he loaded his rifle, not from fear, but from ingrained habit. The mountains held unforgiving laws, and wolves respected no boundary. As he stepped out, he caught sight of the prints again, more distinct now in the pale morning light. 3 trails running side by side, winding down the hill toward the edge of the forest line. He knelt, brushing the snow away from one paw print. At first, the tracks weren't panicked, but the deeper he examined, the more scattered they grew. Something must have spooked her. Ethan pressed on. His boots crunched steadily over the snow as he delved deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, scented with pine and frost. The trees crowded around him, their dark trunks standing like silent sentinels against the white expanse. He moved cautiously, senses sharp scanning for any sign of life. Ahead, a faint cry pierced the stillness. Not a bark, not quite a whimper. He quickened his step. After nearly an hour, the tracks led him to the edge of an abandoned logging road. Half buried beneath years of neglect stood a weathered structure, wide and forlorn. A weathered building sagged under the burden of rusted tin walls and a shattered roof. Above the entrance, a faded sign read Evergreen Kennel and Breeding Company. He exhaled slowly, his breath forming a mist in the cold air. "So this is the place you came from," he whispered almost to himself. The door hung unevenly on its hinges. Inside, the air reeked of rust and decay. Ethan clicked on his flashlight, its beam piercing through the shadows, revealing row upon row of cages lined against the wall. Some still held battered collars and torn scraps of blankets. The floor was strewn with broken chains and gnawed ropes. He crouched beside one cage, his gloved hand tracing the rusty bars. Flakes of rust crumbled away, exposing deep claw marks etched into the metal. A harsh truth settled within him. Grace hadn't just run off. She had returned to the very place where her fear was born. He whispered softly, "Grace, it's okay. I'm here." No answer came, only the soft sigh of wind slipping through cracks in the shattered roof. He followed the faint tracks farther into the building, navigating a hallway littered with old tools and rotting feed sacks. In the far corner, a flicker of fur caught his eye, a tail disappearing behind a crate. He lowered himself, voice barely a whisper. "Grace girl, you don't have to stay here anymore." A low, trembling growl answered from the shadows. Slowly, Grace emerged, dusted with snow, eyes wide and glassy with terror. Behind her, 2 pups whimpered, pressing close to their mother's legs. Ethan's chest tightened with pain. He stayed still, sinking to one knee, trusting his voice to reach her. "It's me. You don't belong to this place anymore." She paused, her tail twitching uncertainly. Ethan extended his hand, palm facing upward, just like the night he had freed her. The flashlight trembled slightly in his other hand, casting dancing shadows on the crumbling walls. Grace's breath quickened, her body taut. Caught between instinct and fragile trust, the silence stretched heavy with hope and fear. Then from outside, the faint drone of a motor engine shattered the quiet. Tires crunched on the snow-covered ground. Ethan turned his head as headlights glowed dimly through the broken doorway. The truck door slammed, and a familiar voice rang out, "Ethan!" It was Helen Ward, stepping out from the embrace of light, bundled in her thick wool coat, her auburn gray hair tucked beneath a knitted cap. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold breath clouding in small puffs as she hurried to his side. In her hands, she carried a sturdy rope and a small emergency lantern. "I heard your call on the CB," she said, steady and calm. "Figured you'd need backup before you froze solid." Ethan smiled faintly, a wave of relief washing over his tense shoulders. "You were right." Helen's eyes swept over the cages, the corroded chains and the ramshackle ruin of the place, her jaw tightening. "So this was it," she murmured. "This is where she came from." Ethan nodded quietly. "And where she nearly didn't survive." Helen knelt beside him, her knees creaking softly on the cold concrete floor. Her fingers brushed the rusted metal of a cage. "Sorry." "I've seen places like this before," she said, voice edged with grim familiarity. "Back when I worked with the Bureau of Land Management rounding up wild horses." "What?" "I've seen scenes like this before," she reflected, her voice steady. "Back when I served with the Bureau of Land Management among wild horses, it wasn't just dogs. Yet cruelty, no matter its form, wears a familiar face." She paused, her eyes drifting far away. Recalling a mare I once tried to rescue, she'd been beaten so mercilessly that no one could get near her. I believed that if I'd just showed her kindness, she'd heal. But that hope never came to pass. What she needed was proof that someone truly cared. Meanwhile, Ethan looked at her, seeing for the first time that the lines beneath her eyes weren't signs of age, but marks of survival. "You still believe kindness matters even after all this?" Helen gave a soft smile. "Kindness won't fix the world, but it holds back the darkness from swallowing the part of us worth saving." Her words hung in the chill air like silent prayers drifting upward. Ethan turned to Grace. The mother dog remained frozen, trembling by the crate. He set down the flashlight, took a cautious step, then knelt again. "Hey," he murmured gently. "You came back here for a reason, didn't you? To face it one last time, to prove it no longer owns you." The pups softly whimpered, their tiny paws skidding on the icy ground. Grace's eyes flicked between them and Ethan. For a fragile heartbeat, silence ruled, just the wind whispering through shattered rafters. Then something shifted. Grace lowered her head, caught a scent, and took a tentative step forward. Then another. Ethan stayed rooted, hand reaching out, heart racing. "That's it, girl. Come home." When she finally reached him, she stopped just shy of his knee. Her eyes shimmered, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something long held within. She nudged his hand with her nose, then gave it a gentle lick. Ethan exhaled, a tremble catching in his chest. Behind him, Helen whispered quietly, "Sometimes healing isn't forgetting. It's just finding the courage to come back." Ethan looked at the dogs, Grace, Hope, and Echo, standing united amid that ruined place. The shadows of their past clung to the broken walls, but the warmth between them burned brighter than the cold. He rose slowly, gesturing toward the door. "Let's go home." Grace followed the pups, trailing close by. As they stepped into the falling snow, the old building loomed silently behind them, a monument to all they'd endured. Ethan glanced back once quietly, whispering, "It doesn't own you anymore." The snow grew heavier, but it didn't bite. It washed away the past instead. Grace walked beside him, her fur brushing his leg, eyes glowing with a peace hard won. For the first time, they were walking away from what was gone. Together. The sun hung low over the valley that afternoon, pale and uncertain, filtered through a thin veil of snowy clouds. Wyoming stretched vast and lonely beneath that light hill's blanketed white forests edged with frost, the wind whispering ancient secrets amidst the pines. Ethan Cole drove down the narrow dirt road toward the town. Grace sat upright in the truck bed behind him, ears alert, with the two pups nestled securely beneath her warm belly. The weight of yesterday still bore down heavily on his heart. The forsaken kennel, the corroded cages, and the scars etched across Grace's neck spoke a silent, haunting truth. He couldn't simply walk away. The quiet town of Lander stretched out before him like a weathered postcard at the valley's edge. Just a few brick buildings, a diner with a flickering neon glow, and the sheriff's office marked by a wooden star nailed firmly beside its entrance. Ethan pulled up and parked. The sign read, "Sheriff's Department, Fremont County." Inside, the air carried the faint scent of stale coffee and aged paperwork. Behind a cluttered desk sat Sheriff Tom Harland, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his gray mustache framing eyes as rough and worn as river stones. His uniform was impeccable, yet his worn posture revealed a weariness born from years battling small-town politics. A half-eaten sandwich sat beside his coffee cup. He looked up sharply when Ethan stepped in, arching an eyebrow. "You must be the Navy guy Helen mentioned," he said, his voice thick with the slow drawl of the plains. Ethan nodded. "I found something I think you'll want to see." He laid a folder on the desk, revealing photographs, shots of the kennel, the cages, the chains and the faded sign. The sheriff leafed through them carefully, brow knitting. "Evergreen Kennel thought that place shut down years ago." Ethan spoke softly. "It did, but someone's using it again, and it's definitely not by the book. Grace, the German shepherd I rescued, came from there. I found collars, feeding logs, even crates labeled for transport." Harlan exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Got any proof it's still active?" Ethan's jaw clenched tight. "Tire tracks fresh. Lights the place is definitely in operation again." For a beat, the sheriff said nothing. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, then rose to close the blinds. When his voice returned, it was low and cautious. "You didn't hear this from me, but if that kennel's running, it's under Earl Dawson's control. The man owns half the land from here all the way to Riverton cattle feedlots and some side businesses no one dares ask about. His trucks roll after dark, always have." Ethan's eyes sharpened, knowing no one dares block his way. Son Harlan said quietly, "Earl's got connections with deep pockets and razor-sharp tempers. I've worn this badge long enough to understand what happens to those who pry where they shouldn't. Ethan leaned in, his voice gravelly and firm. Maybe it's time someone did pry. Harlan studied him in silence for a moment, then shook his head. Don't be a hero, Cole. This town has a way of burying its martyrs. Ethan left without a word. The wind had picked up swirling fine snow across the street as he made his way back to his truck. Grace let out a soft bark, sensing the storm brewing in his mind. Yeah, he muttered, turning over the engine. We'll take care of this our way. That evening he returned to Helen's shelter. The old barn was bathed in the warm orange glow of sunset. Helen moved slowly inside restocking shelves, her motions deliberate and heavy with exhaustion. When she saw him, she paused, drying her hands on her apron. You went to the sheriff, didn't you? She asked quietly. Yeah, Ethan admitted. He's not going to touch it. Helen's shoulders drooped with a heavy sigh. It didn't surprise her Earl Dawson's name carved a veil of silence all around. He was moving animals under the cover of night, Ethan declared, fiercely, determination burning in his eyes. I am going to uncover where they're sending them. Helen froze, alarm clear on her face. Ethan, please don't. You've already risked enough. Those people aren't just shady, they're dangerous, she warned. He gave a faint smile, not prideful, but touched with sorrow. I've faced danger before. Helen stepped closer, her brow tightening with concern. Despite the years, she still carried herself with tall, graceful poise, her silver-streaked auburn braid draped over one shoulder. Her eyes, normally gentle, now shimmered with a mix of fear and resolve. You're off duty now, Ethan. No uniform, no backup, no orders, no brothers watching your six. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, laminated card. His Navy SEAL ID edges worn and folded from years in his wallet. He pressed it firmly into her hand. If I don't come back, he said solemnly, you call that number. Tell them I completed my final mission. Helen's voice cracked. Don't talk like that. I'm not chasing trouble, he said softly. But I'm not walking away from it either. A heavy silence filled the room. The wind rattled the windows as Helen's hands trembled slightly, staring down at the simple plastic card. A symbol heavy with unspoken sacrifice. She had lost her husband to war long ago, and here stood another soldier, bearing the same weight of duty etched deep in his eyes. You remind me of him, she whispered. He never stopped fighting either. Ethan's voice softened in the dim light. Maybe fighting is just another way we hold on to what matters. That night the valley was swallowed whole by darkness. Heavy clouds rolled in, burdened with snow. Ethan parked his truck atop a ridge, gazing down at the deserted kennel below. The engine was dead silent. The cold air bit at his skin. Grace rested quietly beside him, her eyes locked on a faint glow far down the slope. Ethan lifted a pair of binoculars, peering through the blur of falling snow. He spotted movement, men hauling crates, the glint of metal and the low rumble of engines waking from slumber. 2 trucks were stationed by the loading dock, their sides branded with Dawson Feed and Supply, the same logo he'd seen plastered on billboards outside town. Ethan readjusted his camera, snapping photos, license plates, faces, timestamps, each frame knotting fear deeper in his gut. He knew this routine well, military precision, silent and swift. These weren't farmers, they were smugglers. The clock on the dash ticked past midnight. One truck growled to life, headlights piercing the cold night. Ethan ducked down, watching as they loaded the final cage. The faint, frantic barks of dogs, desperate and muffled, floated upward on the icy air. His fingers clenched tight around the camera. Got you, he whispered fiercely. Then suddenly, a blinding flash of light swept across the ridge, a spotlight. Ethan froze. The beam swung again, locking onto his truck. Grace barked sharply, while shouts rose from below. Up, someone commanded. Ethan shoved the camera into his coat pocket, heart hammering. He grabbed the keys, but the engine hesitated, cold and stubborn. The light grew brighter, and the crunch of boots pushing through snow sounded closer. The night silence shattered like glass. Their bond deepened amid a night ignited by fierce movement, an urgent chase, ragged breaths, biting frost and mounting fear. As the harsh beam cut through the shadows, Ethan's heart seized. He caught a clear glimpse of one of the hunters in its glare. It was Earl Dawson himself, large, grizzled in his 60s hawkish white beard, framing a face marked by a scar slicing through his left brow. His eyes were sharp and merciless. That was a man who never let a grudge go. Without hesitation, Ethan slammed the accelerator to the floor. Snow erupted behind his tires as he slammed onto the forest path, the roaring truck's headlights dangerously close behind. Grace's bark rang out once more, a fierce warning echo reverberating across the cold valley. The camera pressed tight against Ethan's chest, pulsing like a heartbeat. Doubt crept in, would he make it back? But the truth he carried was too heavy to bury now. The night was merciless, alive with howling winds. Snow fell thick as ash, swirling ghost-like beneath the muted moonlight. Below the ridge, the forest stirred with life. Trucks rumbled over crunching snow, voices cracked through the air, and the harsh bang of cages slamming shut echoed sharply. Ethan Cole crouched low behind a thick band of spruce, his breath fogging the cold air, fleeting and fragile in the dark. Pain still pulsed in his legs from the last frantic chase, yet adrenaline silenced the ache. He adjusted the worn strap of his field pack and murmured, "This is it, Grace. One last mission." At his side, the German shepherd lifted her head, her black and tan coat brushed with snowflakes. Her steady breath embodied sharp alertness. Behind her, the two pups, Hope and Echo, watched with wide, watchful amber eyes. Nearly 8 weeks old now, growing stronger, swifter, their lean forms hardened from endless days breathing the wild air. Ethan offered a subtle Navy signal with 2 fingers. Grace understood immediately, lowering her head and settling into patient silence. Downhill, the evergreen kennel glowed faintly under a lone floodlight's cold glare. The very place that once held Grace captive now imprisoned a dozen terrified dogs. Ethan caught their muffled whimpers carried on the wind. Desperation echoed in those distant cries. He swept the scene through his binoculars, scanning methodically. 3 guards paced outside, thick-coated flashlights piercing the swirling snow. One tall and broad clutched a burning cigarette between his lips. Another nervously paced near the trucks. The third, squat and bald, swung a rifle loosely over his shoulder. Ethan waited patiently until a howl of wind masked his footsteps, then slipped forward silently. He moved between towering snowdrifts, boots sinking soundlessly. The air carried cold oil and damp wood. Every noise was amplified, the crunch of his boots, the distant hum of engines, the low growl of some wild thing trapped beyond the bars. At the rusted side door cracked open partway, he slipped inside. The stench hit him first, filth-cold metal and raw fear. Inside, rows of stacked cages held dogs of every breed, shepherds, collies, mutts, thin, shivering silhouettes with eyes gleaming in the flashlight's beam. "Steady now?" Ethan breathed softly. He reached for the lockbox near the door, pried out a crowbar, and began to work. Cage by cage, the locks popped free. The dogs burst forth, tails tucked low, confusion and fear painting their movements. But the clatter of metal rang loud and immediate, setting off an alarm through the empty warehouse. From outside, a sharp shout sliced through the wind. "Hey, someone's in there!" Ethan's body froze. Clumsy boots thudded on the wooden floorboards. Seizing a broken chain from the ground, he swung once, smashing the overhead light bulb into shards. The sharp clatter of boots echoed across the wooden floor. He snatched up a shattered chain lying on the ground and swung it violently at the flickering bulb above. Darkness shattered the silence as the dogs barked with wild desperation. Suddenly, the door slammed open, flooding the room with harsh flashlight beams. A voice shouted somewhere ahead. Ethan ducked behind a tower of crates. A bullet hit metal with a sharp spark. He rolled, slammed hard onto the floor, then crawled desperately toward the rear exit. The gunfire ceased, replaced by heavy footsteps pounding closer. One man lunged, seizing Ethan's coat. Ethan twisted free, driving his elbow into the attacker's ribs, then struck again, sending the man crashing backward into a stack of cages. Another assailant came from behind, swinging a metal pipe. The blow struck Ethan's injured leg, the one that never quite healed. He grunted, dropping to one knee as pain exploded through him like lightning. The burly guard raised his weapon once more. "Think you can interfere with Dawson's business?" the man snarled. Ethan grabbed the nearest weapon, an iron hook swinging fiercely. It caught the man across the shoulder, knocking him sprawling. But before he could recover, the taller guard drove a brutal kick into his ribs. The air was forced from his lungs. The world spun and blurred. He crawled toward the back wall as the men shouted behind him, "He's not walking out alive." Then, slicing through the chaos, came a low, guttural bark from the shadows. Grace burst through the side door like a living shadow, her bristling eyes blazing with fire. She lunged at the armed guard, knocking him down before he could raise his weapon. Her teeth flashed fiercely. Hope and Echo followed, small yet fierce, weaving between the men's legs, snapping and snarling. "Go," Ethan gasped, clutching the wall. Grace turned her gaze toward him, eyes locking with his in a silent understanding. In that moment, soldier and dog shared a wordless command, a trust forged through pain. She barked once sharply, then dashed toward the far end of the building. Ethan followed, limping, dragging his wounded leg. The air thickened with the scent of smoke. Somewhere a lantern had been knocked over oil, spilling onto the floor. A spark caught flame. The fire spread rapidly, licking up wooden beams and cages. Dogs bolted in panic, their frantic cries echoing through the hall. Ethan grabbed his camera from his pocket, still intact, and shoved it into his coat. Grace led him to a narrow corridor he hadn't noticed before. At its end was a hatch, half covered by a tarp, leading into a service tunnel. Cold air seeped through its cracks. Ethan pulled it open. "You first," he coughed. Grace hesitated briefly, then plunged into the tunnel with the pups close behind. He followed, crawling through the tight passage. The walls dripped cold condensation, chilling his palms to the bone. Behind him, the fire roared louder and louder, the roof creaking under the growing strain until a violent sound tore through the night, an explosion. The fierce shockwave hurled him forward, heat chasing him down the tunnel like a relentless beast. He burst out into the open air, rolling into the snow. Flames roared behind him, painting the valley in angry shades of orange. Coughing hard, he pulled himself upright. Grace was already by his side, whining softly. Her fur was singed around the edges. Hope and Echo pressed close, trembling. "We made it," Ethan rasped, but his leg gave out beneath him, blood soaking through torn fabric. In the distance, sirens wailed, soft at first, then growing louder. Helen Ward's rescue truck appeared through the swirling storm, ready to save them. Headlights cut sharply through the thick smoke. She sprang out, wrapped tightly in her heavy parka, her face pale but resolute. "Ethan," she called out, rushing toward him. He tried to rise but couldn't manage it. She steadied him by the shoulders, gently lowering him onto the snowy ground. His breaths came ragged and uneven, each misting in the cold night air. "You shouldn't have risked coming," he muttered weakly, clears throat. "I refuse to lose another soldier," she declared fiercely. Tears cutting paths down her wind-brushed cheeks. Behind them, police vehicles arrived, Sheriff Harland among the first to step out. Officers sprinted toward the blaze, weapons drawn. The last smugglers were hauled from the smoke, coughing, swearing in defeat. Among them, Earl Dawson staggered forward, his heavy coat scorched and stained with soot. He shouted about property and rights, until Sheriff Harland slammed him against a patrol car, silencing him. "Your run is over, Dawson," the sheriff said evenly. "You're no longer above the law." Helen draped a blanket over Ethan's shoulders. "You saved them," she whispered softly. "You saved every last one." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the burning wreckage where freed dogs bounded through the snow, their forms glowing in the flames' light. Grace settled beside him, resting her head gently on his arm. Her eyes mirrored the fire, not with fear this time, but with a tender, almost human softness. The paramedics arrived, red lights flashing against the freshly fallen snow. One young medic, freckles scattered across his steady-faced features, knelt beside Ethan. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "If that wound had been just a fraction deeper, you would have lost your leg." Ethan barely heard the words. His eyes found Grace's face dusted with ash, her gaze steady and calm, unwavering in its quiet strength. He reached out with trembling fingers, brushing her ear. "We're home now, Grace," he whispered softly. Snowflakes drifted gently down, sizzling as they touched the dying embers. The violent night gave way to a fragile, glowing silence. Man and dog breathed together beneath a sky finally cleared of smoke. As a month passed and the Wyoming Valley softened under spring's first breath, the snow began to melt, revealing earth rich and dark beneath the thaw. Streams carved fresh paths through fields, carrying away the last remnants of winter. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the newly rebuilt barn atop the hill. The same ground that once held the cruelty of cages now blossomed anew, a sanctuary of life. A wooden sign, freshly painted white and blue, hung proudly above the gate, Grace's haven. Ethan Cole stood beside it, hammer in hand, his leg wrapped but steady beneath him. His hair darkened by soot and hard work stirred in the cool breeze. The scar along his temple had faded to a fine line, though the shadows beneath his eyes still told stories of sleepless nights. Nearby, Helen Ward adjusted a fence rail with quiet, unyielding strength, the same spirit that had carried her through decades of struggle. She wore her usual wool coat, sleeves rolled to her elbows, silver strands of hair gleaming in the sunlight. "You'd think a Navy SEAL would know how to hold a hammer straight," she teased, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her gloved hand. Ethan offered a faint smile. "Breaking things has always been easier for me than building them. Rebuilding, that's where I find my strength." The soft pitter-patter of paws in the dirt caught their ears. Grace moved across the yard, her coat gleaming with health, her stride strong and self-assured. Two playful pups trailed closely behind her, Hope slightly bigger and always eager to take the lead, and Echo the quieter soul observing the world with cautious, watchful eyes. Around them, nearly 24 rescued dogs roamed freely in the wide enclosure, tails wagging, noses pressed into the soft earth. Some were elder dogs moving slowly with the weight of years. Others were young, tasting freedom's breath for the very first time. The barn itself had been reborn. Inside walls had been patched and freshly painted. Sunlight spilled through the fixed windows in golden streams. Wooden stalls had been transformed into warm, welcoming kennels lined with cozy blankets, a sanctuary made real. Along one wall, Helen's desk stood beneath a corkboard crowded with notes, adoption forms, and photos of dogs who'd already found their forever homes. Opposite Ethan had hung a pine-carved plaque honoring those once caged and those brave enough to open the door to new beginnings. Grace padded up beside him, nudging his hand until he reached down to scratch behind her ear. "You like all this, don't you?" he whispered. Her eyes, deep, warm brown, and steady, locked with his, filled with memories. She let out a single bark, as if to give her heartfelt approval. Helen approached quietly, her steps light, despite her years. "We're almost there," she said softly. "Next week families will start visiting. Can you believe it? Just a month ago, this place was pure hell." Ethan glanced around the sprawling fields, the joyful sounds of dogs at play carried on the breeze. "Sometimes the darkest places make room for the brightest miracles," he murmured. They worked side by side until the sun dipped below the horizon, hammering sanding painting. As daylight faded, the valley shimmered in golden hues. Helen brewed coffee on the porch stove, the rich aroma mingling with the scents of pine and thawing earth all around them. They settled on the steps, mugs warm in their hands, watching the dogs run and tumble across the wide field. Grace lay nearby, head resting on her paws, eyes half-lidded in quiet peace. After a long moment, Helen broke the silence. "You've been quieter lately," she said gently. Not the peaceful, good sort of quiet. Ethan didn't meet her eyes. His gaze drifted to where the sun had slipped behind the distant mountains. "I still hear it sometimes," he confessed. "The explosions, the radioactive wind, the screams. When the breeze shifts just right, it feels like it's all still happening." Helen's voice softened with empathy. "Have you ever told anyone?" He shook his head. What's left to say the war's over? I'm still here. Helen nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with understanding. My husband used to say the same thing. But you know Ethan. She turned toward him, her face bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. Not every battle is meant to end in victory. Some are simply meant to be survived. Ethan gave a faint smile. You sound like someone who's done a lifetime of surviving. Maybe way too much, she replied with a quiet, knowing laugh. But I've learned this healing doesn't always come from people. Sometimes it arrives on four legs, furry and faithful. He glanced down and suddenly noticed Hope and Echo had silently edged close, curling against his boots. Their warmth seeped into him, breaths slow and steady alongside his own. Grace lifted her head, her vigilant eyes watching over them all, a silent guardian of hope and strength, curled protectively around his boots. Their bodies radiated warmth, their gentle breaths mingling with his own. Grace lifted her head, her gaze keen and watchful. Her tail thumped once on the porch as Helen reached out, placing her hand over his. You didn't just save them, Ethan. They're showing you how to be alive again, she said, her voice hanging between them like a sacred vow. He remained silent, though his throat tightened in quiet recognition. The wind stirred the trees, carrying the soft laughter of volunteers painting inside the barn. Two local students lending their hands to rebuild. One was Caleb, a tall, freckled 19-year-old with a shy smile. The other, Mariah, spirited and bright, her curly red hair and paint-smudged sleeves speaking of hope. They were the future, those untouched by war, but determined to heal its scars. As night deepened, Ethan rose and walked toward the open field. The moon hung low, casting silver light on patches of lingering snow. He could still trace the faint scar where the kennel had stood, the burnt outline, now cloaked beneath fresh grass. Kneeling down, he ran a gloved hand over the earth and whispered, "No more cages." Rising, his reflection caught in the barn's window, a soldier-turned-builder, his face marked by time but softened. The pain lingered, but it no longer held dominion over him. From his coat pocket he pulled out his old Navy SEAL insignia, its metal worn smooth by years. For a long moment he held it, feeling the weight of every ghost it carried. Then he moved toward the yard's edge where the last snowdrift clung to the grass. Grace followed silently, her shadow close beside him. Ethan crouched gently, placing the insignia onto the snow, where it caught a faint moonlight gleam. "You did your part," he whispered. "Now rest." He watched as the melting snow slowly buried it, swallowing it into the earth. Behind him, Helen's soft voice called, "Coffee's getting cold." Ethan turned, a faint smile touching his lips. Grace brushed against his leg as they walked back together. Inside the cabin window, the fire flickered warmly, steady and comforting. For the first time, it felt less like surviving and more like coming home. The first snow of December returned like a quiet visitor bearing peace. The mountain stood draped in white once more, but the wind no longer howled fiercely. Instead, it whispered, gentle calm and familiar. Along the fence of the rebuilt barn at Grace's Haven, pine garlands entwined with golden ribbons hung gracefully. Warm lights glowed softly from the windows, flickering gently against the snow. For the first time in living memory, laughter echoed across this land that once only knew sorrow. Inside the main cabin, Ethan Cole stood by a small pine tree he had brought in from the woods that morning. It was small and uneven, its branches crooked, but to him it was perfect. He adorned it with tiny bulbs powered by an aging generator, each one blinking weakly yet stubbornly like stars refusing to fade. He wore a flannel shirt beneath a thick vest. His beard neatly trimmed his face, lighter than it had been in years. His right leg still bore a faint limp, but tonight it didn't hold him back. "Looks good," Helen Ward's warm, teasing voice came from behind as she carried a tray of fresh cinnamon rolls, their sweet scent filling the room with the comforting fragrance of nostalgia. Her voice wrapped in warmth and playful affection. She brought in a tray of steaming cinnamon rolls, their sweet, comforting aroma filling the room with tender memories. She wore a thick green sweater, paired with a vibrant red scarf, that added a festive spark of youthful charm. The cold kissed her cheeks, giving them a radiant glow. I'd say she looked like a splendid navy Christmas tree. Ethan chuckled quietly. "I've had better luck in battle zones than finding a straight one," he joked. Helen placed the tray gently on the table, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, dogs frolicked through the snow, led by Grace, her fur shimmering in the soft light, while Hope and Echo followed in a whirlwind of energy, their joyful barks mingling with laughter as townsfolk tossed sticks their way. It was the grand opening of Grace's Haven. News had spread quickly following Earl Dawson's arrest. The tale of the soldier and the dog who saved each other echoed throughout the small towns of Fremont County. Now neighbors and strangers alike arrived with blankets, food, and thoughtful gifts. The once forsaken property now buzzed with life. Near the doorway, a young family stepped inside, a man with worn hands and a gentle smile. His wife held tightly to the arm of a small girl who walked carefully, tapping the ground with a white cane. The girl was about 7, slim and fair, with soft brown curls cascading freely. She wore a wool hat topped with a red pom-pom that nearly veiled her eyes. Her name was Lucy Carter Blind since birth. Helen greeted them with warmth. "Come in, dear. The fire is warm, and so are our hearts." Lucy smiled, tilting her head slightly, as if catching a secret tune invisible to others. "It smells like cinnamon and freshly fallen snow," she whispered. Ethan watched as Grace advanced carefully, her steps deliberate and tender. The room fell silent as the German shepherd came to a halt before the girl. Lucy reached out her small hand, trembling softly, then rested it on Grace's head. The fur was thick and warm. Grace didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in closer, inviting the girl to explore her face. Suddenly, Lucy giggled a sound as pure and fresh as the snow outside. "She's smiling," she said. "I can feel it. She's smiling at me." Helen's eyes glistened softly. "She only does that to the right souls," she whispered. Grace's puppies bounded in next. Hope nuzzled Lucy's hand while Echo pressed his body affectionately against her leg, tail wagging. The little girl gasped. This one feels like the sound of bells," she said, tracing Echo's fur gently with her fingers. Then she faced Helen and Ethan, her smile radiant. "I can hear the light." Ethan's chest tightened, a fragile mix of breaking and healing stirring deep within him. Helen placed a soft hand on his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what you built, Ethan, a place where light can be heard once more." As night deepened, Grace's Haven truly became a sanctuary. Lanterns glowed warmly along the porch. Children tossed balls for the dogs. Volunteers served steaming cider and hearty stew. Elder men, once avoiding crowds for years, gathered by the fire to swap stories, while teenagers hung sparkling ornaments on the fresh pine tree outdoors. For the first time, there were no shadows in Ethan's eyes, only a profound sense of gratitude. Later that night, after the last guests had departed, Ethan settled by the fireplace. Grace rested beside him, her head gently lying on his knee. The pups, spent from play, nestled close to the hearth, twitching softly as they dreamed. Helen washed the dishes silently in the kitchen, humming a gentle Christmas melody. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out the last memento of his former life, a small metal dog tag he'd kept long after letting go of his seal emblem. Its edges were worn smooth, the letters nearly faded away. He turned it over in his palm, feeling its cold, solid weight. Then, with quiet reverence, he reached for Grace's collar. "You deserve this more than I ever did," he whispered. Helen glanced up from the sink, her eyes softening as she watched him thread the chain through the tag and fasten it around Grace's neck. It shimmered faintly in the firelight. "There," he said gently. "Your proof that goodness survives." Grace lifted her head, resting it against his hand, the tag jingling softly. Helen wiped her hands and settled into the chair across from him. "Quite the medal ceremony. Commander!" Ethan chuckled low. "She outranks me now." They sat quietly for a while, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the snow began to fall again, not harsh and biting as before, but gentle, lazy flakes drifting beneath the porch light. The world felt smaller, safer somehow. Helen glanced at the pups curled near the fire. You know, sometimes I think they remember that night, the one caught in the snowstorm. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe, but their dreams no longer hold fear, only flight. Helen smiled faintly. That's what you're doing too, running again in a better direction. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on this window where the Christmas tree's reflection shimmered on the glass. Beyond it, the snowy field stretched wide and white, marked by paw prints and soft lantern light. When Helen went to bed, Ethan stayed by the fire. Grace shifted closer, resting her head gently on his shoulder. Her breathing calm, steady, full of life. He turned back to the window. Snowflakes fluttered past, each catching the glow of the porch lights before melting away. For the first time in years, the wind carried no echoes of war. Instead, it brought laughter, the bark of dogs, and the warmth born of hard-won peace. He leaned back, voice low and certain. "We're home, Grace." She responded with a soft sigh, her tail thumping once against the floor. Outside, the night hummed with quiet happiness. The valley that had once held only silence now breathed gently with life's sounds. Pause on snow, distant laughter, and the whisper of peace settling to stay. Some stories transcend survival. They are about grace. What happened on that frozen road wasn't chance. It was a silent miracle one only God himself can spin between the broken and the brave. A soldier found a reason to live again. And 3 lost souls found a home. Sometimes heaven doesn't roar with thunder or blaze with fire. It whispers through a dog's warm breath, laughter of a child, and the light that always returns after the storm. As you watch this story, take a breath and remember, miracles aren't lost to time. They dwell in every gentle deed, every choice to forgive, every courageous step you take toward hope. If this story has moved your soul, pass it along to someone who needs to feel the light still shining in our world. Share a prayer or a blessing in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to our channel to keep the spirit of love, faith, and redemption alive. May God watch over you, guard your home, and remind you that no matter how fierce the night, His grace is unyielding, forever lighting your path.